Welcome back to News Talk. Coming your way at the bottom of the hour, a very full sports page. Tom Threlkeld here to talk about the Nationals, Capitals, and Wizards. Right now, though, we're joined by Steve Shepard. He's campaigns and elections editor for Politico. Good having you here. Thanks so much for your time. Always good to be here. Really appreciate your being here on a day when there's so much to talk about. We keep hearing, and I mentioned this a moment ago with Senator Kaine, we keep hearing that Hillary Clinton's delegate lead is so big that he, Bernie Sanders, is highly unlikely to capture the nomination. And yet, look back at the last handful of contests, even more than that, and he keeps finding the win column. Why can't she shake him?
Well, Bernie Sanders, you mentioned, he's won now 7 of the last 8 states. It'll likely be 8 of 9. He's very likely to win in Wyoming, and the caucus is there on Saturday. The problem, the reason, first of all, that he's doing well is most of these states set up pretty well for him. In Wisconsin last night, about 85% of voters were white. That is basically the only other states where we've had exit polls that have showed an electorate that white is Iowa, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Vermont, places where you would expect to see that. Hillary Clinton has built a huge lead, though, in delegates by winning in states like Texas, states throughout the South, a state like Florida, also winning narrowly in other big states like Ohio and Illinois. That has given her a big delegate lead that even as Bernie Sanders wins state after state after state, he's having trouble catching up. He's still down by more than 200 pledged delegates. This doesn't even include super delegates, the people, the party insiders who can decide the nomination. He's going to have trouble, and unless he wins New York, and wins New York by a sizable margin, he's going to have even more trouble, and time is running out.
Let's talk about New York. You mentioned that Wyoming is next, but I think most of the focus, most of the attention is on the Empire State, the state that Hillary Clinton represented in the Senate, where she and Bill Clinton still have a house. Of course, Bernie Sanders is from there, too, so it's a fascinating contest. So there's going to be a lot of attention paid by the candidates to that state between now and when voters cast ballots. Is this going to be a time of nervousness, or where the Clinton camp is fending off lots of questions from the press about, why haven't you been able to put this guy away? What happens if you stumble again and lose? This will be a kind of a nuisance, if nothing more than that.
I think that's exactly right, Bruce. New York is a state where both candidates can claim some sort of home state advantage. It's a state where the race is getting closer. Hillary Clinton had a 20, 30-point lead a month ago or so. Now that leads down to about 12 points. If Bernie Sanders, even if he wins by 1 point, the delegate math is basically a wash. She remains prohibitively in front. But at some point, you have to ask the question, what's going on here? Why isn't she connecting with voters? Why are they going for Bernie Sanders instead of Hillary Clinton? And if she can't win, say, by 10 points in New York, those questions are really going to stick with her moving into the next set of states, which includes here, or close to here in Maryland.
We talked with Tim Kaine, a Clinton supporter, a few moments ago. Tomorrow we will air an interview with Ben Cardin. He, a senator from Maryland, he is also a Clinton supporter. And both are talking about how the ongoing nature of this process is good for her, and they're expressing no alarm. And yet, at a certain point, the questions will really mount. Finish this guy off. I mean, he was. You think back to the beginning, this independent socialist who most Americans, I don't think, had really heard of a year ago, is now giving her everything she can handle, and that will be the drumbeat, if nothing else, in the press, and that might not matter for much, but it'll be a very nuisancey kind of drumbeat for 2 weeks more.
Yeah, and from a campaign mechanics perspective, one of the most interesting things is you would think that she should have all the resources in the world to beat him. It's the opposite. He outspent her by more than a 2-to-1 margin on the air in Wisconsin on television advertising. He's likely to outspend her in New York, where television advertising is very expensive. She's running out of money. She's been relying more on big donors, many of whom have already given the maximum allowable amount. We have pretty strict campaign finance rules in this country. You can only give $2,700 in a primary campaign, an individual donor, to one candidate. Bernie Sanders is raising money from hundreds of thousands of people online, more than 1 million online, and those people are giving $20 a month, $30 a month. They can come back, and he can get raising money from them.
They're well under their limit.
He raised her by roughly $15 million in last month alone. So he's going to have all the resources to take this campaign to New York, to take it to Pennsylvania and Maryland the following week, to take it all the way to California on June 7th. She needs to win some of these bigger states to basically blunt his momentum and really be able to pivot to the general election.
And we read at Politico.com where Sanders' tenaciousness is slowing the White House outreach to the Sanders voters. The president would like to, we believe, would like to be out on the campaign trail, helping her woo some of the people, some of the Democrats who have yet to warm to her, who are now at this moment with him. The president has had some success on the campaign trail, and he's eager to help her in terms of the big picture battle in November.
Right, about 9 in 10 of the Democratic primary voters approve of the job that Barack Obama is doing as president. So, and while they're splitting among the two Democratic candidates, he can bring them together. And he'll be very, very important in doing that, moving forward towards the convention. But he'd like to be able to bring them together behind one candidate, and while he is not endorsed, that candidate is probably Hillary Clinton. And he's been unable to do so thus far because Bernie Sanders is not only hanging around, but he's winning.
Let's talk about Donald Trump. He's got two foes right now. He's got his primary rival, Ted Cruz, and he's got the Stop Trump movement, which some of those people are for Cruz, some would like an alternative to the two candidates I've named. And he's got his hands full right now. Newt Gingrich suggesting publicly to Trump, and wouldn't you love to know what sort of communication there's been privately, but publicly he's saying, you need to reestablish your A game, the winging it, the lack of focus. It's not helping you right now, and it feels like Trump has lost considerable momentum, even as he remains numerically the front runner, no question about that.
Right. I would add he has three enemies, or three
Sure.
opponents, and the third one is himself. He has slipped. You saw last week his comments on abortion, basically having to backtrack immediately, giving inconsistent statements. He's also, I talked about Hillary Clinton and her troubles with money. Donald Trump has not been as quick to open up his checkbook to fund his campaign. He is putting in basically 3 out of every $4 that his campaign is spending comes from his own coffers. He's been less willing to do that. In Wisconsin, he spent less than $300,000 of his own money. He was outspent 6 to 7 to 1 by, if you add up all the money Ted Cruz, all the money John Kasich, all the money the group supporting them spent, and all the money, you mentioned the Stop Trump movement, that they spent to boost Cruz. Now the question is that we move to more favorable terrain for Donald Trump. New York, Pennsylvania, maybe Maryland, Rhode Island, Delaware, Connecticut on April 26th. This is more favorable terrain for Donald Trump. The Stop Trump movement has an interesting quandary here. Do they continue to support Ted Cruz, who, as probably the most conservative candidate in the race, might have trouble appealing to a lot of the moderate Republican voters in the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic? Do they get behind John Kasich, who has won only one state in this process, but can deny Donald Trump delegates if he can win in certain parts of these states that are coming up? Or does the anti-Trump vote get split between those two candidates, and can Donald Trump thread the needle? Haven't seen a lot of strategy there yet. It's going to be interesting to see how that plays out in the next 2 to 3 weeks.
For every cycle in our lifetime, talk of a brokered, in the modern era, because I'm older than you, talk of a brokered convention is crazy talk, it's wishful fantasy stuff and all the rest. There's no denying it now, because high-level Republican operatives are meeting, they are briefing one another, they are strategizing about how a convention would take place where the front runner arriving, in this case Cleveland, lacks the magic number, and that's all about. It's not about finishing first. It's about the magic number, as you know and as our viewers know, being savvy. It's an open topic of conversation right now. Maybe even, and I'll pose this as the question: is it a likelihood at this point?
Yes,
or it is
absolutely
open convention. The delegates.
It is likely at this point, more likely than not, that on the first ballot in the Republican convention in Cleveland, no candidate will have 1,237 delegates. It is possible for Donald Trump to get to that number. He would need to win overwhelmingly in New York. He'd need to basically sweep those April 26 states, which includes Maryland. He would need to win big in California on June 7th. and do well enough in Indiana on May 3rd before that to get some delegates. He would also need to convince a lot of the delegates in Pennsylvania who go into the convention unbound to support him ultimately. If he can do all those things, he can get to 1237. But I think right now, after Wisconsin, and he only came out with 6 delegates, he needs to win between 55 and 60% of the delegates moving forward. That is a faster pace than he's been accruing delegates thus far. It's more likely than not he'll fall short, and then Republicans he'll probably go in with more delegates than anybody else, and they'll probably try to take the nomination away from him on subsequent ballots.
And Ted Cruz, with his very well-oiled machine, his organization, getting a lot of praise for the spade work they're doing, the individual wooing of delegates, the people who we know will be on the floor in Cleveland. Ultimately, we think now deciding this contest, Cruz spending a lot of effort and energy, probably more than Trump, in the wooing of those people.
Absolutely, and that's really important. What's also important is he's going to come in as the second-place candidate. And if you're going to take the nomination away from the guy who's in first, and you don't give it to the guy who's in second, there are going to be a lot of alienated voters in the fall. And you're already going to have that problem with Donald Trump, but it's going to be compounded if you try to take it away from the second-place person. So Ted Cruz is in really good position. I'm not saying he's more likely to be the nominee than Donald Trump, but we're getting to the point where he might be as likely to be the nominee as Donald Trump, even though it seems almost certain that Donald Trump will be #1 going into the convention and Ted Cruz will be #2.
Steve Shepard, campaigns and elections editor for Politico. So much to chew on, so much sort of to look forward to if you're into all of this kind of thing. Thanks for stopping by, as always. Really great to have you here.
Always good to be here.
Steve Shepard, thank you. Headlines in the Forecaster next as we continue on this Wednesday, and then a very full sports page with us, as often, our man Tom Threlkeld.